The wind cut sharp across the open auction yard, carrying with it the mixed scents of hay, dust, and cold metal. Eli Turner tugged his coat tighter, his hands rough from years of ranch work. He had not come to buy. He was here to sell a rusted post-hole digger and maybe an old saddle, anything that might stretch the thin margin between him and bankruptcy for another month. But as he moved past the cattle pens and into the far corner of the lot, his steps slowed. There, in a small pen no bigger than a stall, stood a donkey. Its coat was a mottled gray, matted in places, hanging loose over sharp ribs. The animal stood with its head lowered, the outline of its hip bones cutting hard angles against the pale winter light. One ear tilted toward him, but the rest of its body looked almost hollow, as though life had drained away in slow retreat. Eli had seen animals near death before, but something in this one stance, the way it remained upright despite its frailty, made him linger. The auctioneer's voice carried across the yard, rough and dismissive. "Lot number 92, folks. Can't do much with him, but maybe haul him off to well, you know." Laughter rippled among the small crowd. No one stepped closer. Eli caught a fragment of a whisper from two men nearby. "Not worth the hay you'd waste on him." He should have walked on. His truck still needed a new tire. The feed bill was overdue, and Lily's medication refill was coming up. But Lily, the thought of her stopped him. She'd been pale for months now, the illness keeping her indoors, her once bright spirit dulled to a quiet compliance. His wife had been gone 3 years, but her voice returned in that moment, as clear as if she stood beside him. Asterisk, sometimes the weakest ones surprise you the most. Asterisk. The auctioneer tried again. $1 to start. 1. Just to get him gone. No movement in the crowd. A pause stretched, and then, before he could think himself out of it, Eli raised his hand. The man's gavel came down with an almost sarcastic finality. "Sold for $1 to Turner, is it?" The crowd's laughter followed him to the pen. Someone called out, "Hope you've got a soft spot for lost causes." Eli didn't bother to reply. He found a length of frayed rope, looped it gently around the donkey's neck, and led him toward the truck. The animal moved stiffly, each step uneven, yet there was a quiet steadiness in the way it followed. Loading him was awkward. Eli had to coax him up the ramp plank by plank, murmuring low words without much thought, just a rhythm of sound to keep him moving. The donkey paused halfway, sides heaving, then made the last push on his own. Eli latched the gate and stood for a moment with one hand on the weathered wood, his breath clouding in the cold. The road home was long and mostly empty, the kind where the land stretches wide enough to make a man feel both free and trapped at once. Eli kept one eye on the rearview mirror. The donkey stood without shifting, ears pricked now, gazing at the road behind them as if the past held more interest than where they were headed. When the ranch finally came into view, the light was fading. The house, with its peeling white paint and wraparound porch, looked small against the expanse of land. In the driveway, a thin figure stood waiting. Lily was bundled in a too-large sweater, her long hair tugged by the wind. She didn't wave, just watched as the truck drew closer. Eli parked near the barn. Lily stepped down from the porch slowly, her eyes fixed on the trailer. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice careful. "Something I thought we could give a chance," he said, unlatching the gate. The donkey blinked against the sudden wash of golden light from the low sun. Lily's eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, Eli saw a flicker of the old brightness. She approached with small, deliberate steps, her breath visible in the cooling air. The donkey shifted his weight, but didn't move away. "Is he sick?" she asked, glancing up at her father. "He's been through a lot," Eli replied. "Bought him for $1. Her brow furrowed as if trying to understand why someone would do that. Then she reached out a tentative hand. The donkey's nose met her fingers, warm and surprisingly solid. His eyes, dull in the auction yard, seemed to study her in a long, quiet moment. "I think he's tired," she said softly. "Yeah," Eli murmured, "but maybe not finished." They led him into the barn, spreading fresh straw in the corner stall. The old building smelled of hay and the lingering sweetness of grain, a place that had seen better years, but still stood strong. Eli fetched a bucket of water, watching as the donkey drank slowly, pausing often to breathe. Lily knelt to brush away clumps of dirt from his coat, her movements patient and unhurried. When they stepped outside again, the wind had eased. The last of the light lay stretched across the pasture, painting the grass in a soft orange hue. From the porch, Eli glanced back into the barn. The donkey stood where they had left him, his head slightly lifted now, ears forward as if listening to something distant. Lily leaned against her father's side. "What's his name?" she asked. Eli considered. "Haven't decided yet. Maybe you should." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach full strength, but hinted at its return. "I'll think on it." They stood together for a while, letting the quiet settle. The ranch was still on the edge of trouble. The bills weren't going anywhere, and the winter would be long. But as Eli watched his daughter, thin, recovering, yet with a new light in her gaze, and the frail donkey in the barn, who had somehow followed him all the way here, he felt a shift. It was small, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a thick sheet of ice, but it was there, somewhere deep inside. He knew the story of that $1 donkey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The first night was harder than Eli expected. The donkey lay down soon after being brought into the stall, his breathing shallow and uneven. Eli checked on him every hour, lantern light casting long shadows over the barn walls. By morning, the animal was still alive, though his eyes were half-lidded and dull. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. Lily was there before breakfast, carrying a small bucket of oats cradled against her sweater. She set it down gently and crouched beside the stall, speaking in a low, steady voice. Eli noticed she didn't force touch on him. She let him come to her, even if only by turning his head a few inches. The donkey sniffed at the food, took a single bite, and then rested his head back down. Lily didn't seem discouraged. She just stayed there, humming under her breath as if the sound might keep him anchored. Days slipped into a fragile rhythm. Eli managed the heavier chores, while Lily became the donkey's shadow. She insisted on cleaning his coat with an old brush, working out the knots and caked mud. The first time she tried, the donkey shifted away, unsteady on his legs. But she persisted in her quiet, patient way, and eventually he stood still for her, eyes closing as if the slow strokes of the brush reminded him of something gentle he had once known. It was Lily who gave him his name. She walked into the kitchen one evening, cheeks flushed from the cold, and said, "Dusty, because his coat looks like it's been through 100 storms and still stands." Eli said nothing for a moment, just nodded. The name fit. As Dusty's strength returned in slow increments, small changes became impossible to ignore. He would lift his head when Lily came into the barn, following her with his eyes. His ears, once slack and lifeless, began to twitch at sounds beyond the stall. When she left, he would shift toward the door as if expecting her to return. Eli noticed, too, the way Lily's voice lifted when she spoke to Dusty, the way she laughed softly when he clumsily bumped her shoulder with his nose. One afternoon, while Eli repaired a section of fencing, an old feed supplier named Grant pulled up in his truck. The man stepped out, squinting at the barn. "That your donkey?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward Dusty. "Bought him at auction last week," Eli replied. Grant chuckled. "I'll be damned. Thought he was gone years ago. Belonged to a prospector up north. Fella used him to haul gear through the high passes. Tough as nails, that one. Carried loads for days, without so much as a sip when the snows came in early." Eli studied Dusty from where he stood. "Doesn't look like much now." "Neither do the mountains till you try crossing him," Grant said, before climbing back into his truck and driving away. That night, Eli told Lily the story. Her eyes shone with something between pride and awe. "See," she said, reaching over to scratch Dusty behind the ears. "He's been strong before. He can be again." The ranch itself wasn't getting any easier to run. The drought had left the pastures thin, and the feed bills kept stacking. Eli kept telling himself he didn't need another mouth to feed, especially one that wasn't pulling its weight. But every time he thought about it, he'd picture Lily leaning against Dusty's stall, talking to him like he was the only soul in the world listening. That image was worth more than any ledger could measure. Weeks passed, and Dusty began to follow Lily around the barnyard without being led. He walked with a stiff but determined gait, his ribs still visible but his eyes sharper now. On a crisp morning, Lily tripped over a half-buried feed bucket. Before she could hit the ground, Dusty moved in close, pressing his body into hers, steadying her. She laughed, clinging to his mane for balance. Eli saw the moment from the porch, the sun catching in the frost of the pasture grass, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Despite the small victories, not everyone shared their attachment. At the general store, Eli overheard a neighbor say, "Turner's keeping a dying donkey like it's a house pet. Waste of time. He'd be better off selling it for whatever the slaughter lot would give him." Eli kept his jaw tight and his voice steady when he answered, "He's not for sale." The days grew shorter. A string of cold storms swept through, leaving the air damp and the ground muddy. Dusty weathered it better than Eli expected, though he tired more easily. Lily took to draping an old blanket over his back in the evenings, humming as she secured the knots. Sometimes, Eli would find the two of them standing in the quiet barn long after chores were done, Lily with her hand resting on Dusty's neck, Dusty with his eyes half closed in what looked like trust. One night, as Eli sat by the kitchen window nursing a cup of coffee, he saw them outside. Lily was talking to Dusty under the soft light, spilling from the barn. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He could see it in her posture, how she leaned in like she had a secret to share, how Dusty stood still, as though no force on earth could pull him from that moment. Still, there was a tension that never left Eli entirely. The ranch's problems weren't solved. Winter could still turn hard in an instant, and animals, no matter how much you poured into them, could slip away without warning. He had lost too many to forget that. But watching his daughter's cheeks regain their color, her laughter slowly returning to the house, he knew Dusty had already given them something that didn't have a price. The barn door creaked open one evening as Eli finished stacking hay. Lily came in, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright. "Pa," she said, "I think Dusty's ready for the pasture." Eli hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. "He's been pacing by the gate all day. I think he wants to stretch his legs." So they led him out together, into the fading light. Dusty took slow, deliberate steps at first, then lifted his head and quickened his pace, the wind catching in his coat. Lily laughed, running alongside him. For a moment, the ranch didn't feel heavy. For a moment, it felt alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli leaned on the fence, watching his daughter and the donkey move together through the field. Something in the sight settled in his chest. Not an answer to all the ranch's troubles, but a reminder that not all strength is measured in work done or bills paid. In the distance, the sky darkened in a way that wasn't just the coming of night. A deep bank of clouds rolled in, thick and heavy. The wind shifted, bringing with it a sharp scent of change. Eli's gaze lingered on the horizon longer than he meant to, then drifted back to Lily and Dusty. The air felt different, the stillness before a storm. The storm arrived faster than Eli expected. By morning, the sky was already a bruised gray, the wind pushing hard enough to rattle the barn doors on their hinges. The forecast had warned of strong gusts and lightning, but in this part of the country, warnings often came and went without much to show. This one felt different. The air carried a strange weight, thick and restless, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Eli hitched the trailer early, planning to drive into town for supplies before the worst of it hit. Lily insisted on staying behind. She said Dusty didn't like the sound of the wind, and she wanted to keep him calm. Eli hesitated, but the trip was quick, and the barn was only a short walk from the house. He left her with strict instructions to stay indoors if the weather worsened. She promised she would. By the time Eli reached the feed store, rain had begun to spit against the windshield. He worked quickly, loading sacks of grain and bundles of hay, but the wind was picking up. On the drive back, the first fork of lightning split the horizon, so bright it seemed to burn into his vision. Thunder rolled close behind, deep and sharp enough to make the steering wheel tremble in his hands. Back at the ranch, Lily stood in the barn doorway with Dusty, watching the shifting sky. She had draped his blanket over him, but the donkey's ears twitched at every sudden gust. She stroked his neck, murmuring softly to him. The rain began in earnest, rattling against the tin roof. Then came the flash, not lightning this time, but fire. Eli saw it before Lily did, a jagged streak of flame racing along the far pasture fence. A lightning strike had hit dry grass, and the wind was pushing the fire fast toward the lower barnyard. He shouted for Lily to get inside, but the wind stole most of his words. Lily grabbed Dusty's rope and tried to lead him into the barn, but a violent gust slammed the big door shut. She pulled, but the latch had dropped, locking from the inside. The sudden clang startled Dusty, and he backed up, hooves slipping on the wet ground. Lily looked around for another path, but the fire was already licking at the tall weeds along the fence line. Smoke began to curl into the air, acrid and choking. Eli dropped the feed sacks where he stood and ran, but the fire moved quicker than he did. He could see Lily's small figure through the haze, one hand shielding her face, the other clutching Dusty's lead. A section of the old tool shed's roof gave way, sending a beam crashing down into the path between them. Sparks scattered upward in a dangerous spray. Dusty didn't run. He turned toward the beam, lowering his head. Eli watched, heart hammering, as the donkey shoved against the wood with his shoulders. His legs trembled with the effort, hooves scraping on the muddy ground. Bit by bit, the beam shifted, just enough to open a narrow space. Lily crawled through, coughing hard from the smoke. Dusty moved in close, pressing against her side, nudging her forward. She leaned into him instinctively, letting him guide her through the thickening smoke toward the creek beyond the pasture. His pace was steady, almost deliberate, even as embers floated around them like burning snow. Eli reached the far side of the pasture, just as they emerged from the smoke. Lily stumbled into his arms, her sweater warm with the heat of the fire behind them. Dusty stopped a few paces away, sides heaving, his once gray coat streaked with soot. His ears flicked toward Lily, even as he stood catching his breath. "You're all right," Eli said, his voice rough in his own ears. He wanted to ask what had happened, how she'd managed to get through, but the answer was standing right there in the form of a battered donkey. The fire crew arrived minutes later, their hoses hissing against the flames. Neighbors gathered at the fence line, watching the smoke billow into the sky. Some called out offers of help. Others simply stared at the sight of the soot-blackened animal, standing guard over the girl, who refused to step more than a few feet from him. Eli guided Lily toward the porch, but she resisted until Dusty followed. The donkey's legs wobbled, and for a moment Eli thought he might collapse right there in the yard. But Dusty steadied himself, blinking against the sting of the smoke, and walked on. Once inside, Lily refused to leave him. They brought him into the main barn and laid fresh straw under him, wrapping another blanket over his back. He lowered himself onto the bedding with a heavy exhale, eyes half closing. Eli knelt beside him, one hand resting on the rough line of his neck. The animal's breaths came deep and slow, as if each one was an effort. "You saved her," Eli said quietly, though he doubted Dusty could understand the words. Still, the donkey's ears twitched in his direction, and he opened one eye to meet Eli's gaze. Lily sat cross-legged nearby, her hand resting on Dusty's shoulder. "He didn't leave me, Pa. Not for a second." Eli felt the weight of that statement in his bones. He thought of the day he'd seen Dusty in the auction pen, of the laughter that followed his $1 bid, of the uncertainty he'd carried about keeping him at all. Now, looking at the soot-streaked animal who had stood his ground in front of falling beams and fire, there was no question. Outside, the fire crews finished their work, leaving a blackened strip of land along the pasture fence. The rain had returned, falling soft and steady now, hissing as it touched the last glowing embers. The worst of the danger had passed, but the air still held the scent of smoke. Eli checked Dusty's legs for burns, his hands moving with a care he usually reserved for fragile machinery. There were scrapes along the front knees, likely from shoving against the beam, but nothing life-threatening. Still, the exhaustion was plain. Dusty's eyes drifted closed again, his breathing evening out as sleep took hold. Lily leaned against Eli, her hair smelling faintly of smoke. "We can't ever let him go," she said. "We won't," Eli replied without hesitation. The words felt solid, like a promise he intended to keep. They stayed there for a long time, the three of them in the warm light of the barn, while the rain tapped gently on the roof. Eli could hear the distant murmur of neighbors outside, but their voices faded into the background. All that mattered was here, his daughter safe, the donkey alive, and the knowledge that, somehow, the weakest creature he'd ever seen had turned out to be the strongest when it mattered most. In the quiet that followed, Eli felt something shift inside him again, stronger this time. Dusty was no longer just a reminder of his wife's words or a project to keep Lily's spirits up. He was part of the family now, bound not by purchase or need, but by the kind of loyalty you couldn't buy for any price. Outside, the wind began to calm, the rain smoothing the jagged edges of the night. But Eli knew the image of Dusty pushing against that beam, guiding his daughter through smoke and fire, would never leave him. It was a picture carved deep, a reminder that sometimes salvation came in the most unlikely shape. And though the storm had passed, he had the unshakable feeling that Dusty's story was far from over. Under the dim silver light of dawn, the ranch stood silent, its fences casting long shadows over the frost-kissed grass. Daniel moved slowly toward the barn, his boots crunching against the ground, each step heavy with the weight of decisions made and those still looming. Inside, Midnight shifted in his stall, ears flicking forward as if sensing the unspoken tension in the air. The bond between them had been tested in ways neither man nor beast could have foreseen, and now Daniel faced the final choice, one that could either save the horse or condemn him. The sheriff's voice from the night before still echoed in Daniel's mind, stern yet reluctant. Asterisk, you've got until Friday to prove he's not dangerous. After that, he's out of my hands. Asterisk. Daniel had stared at the ground then, not trusting himself to answer. He knew Midnight wasn't dangerous, not truly, but fear had a way of rewriting truth, especially in a small town that thrived on gossip. In the stall beside Midnight, the rescued foal pressed its head against the wooden slats, nickering softly. That little one had already started to trust Daniel, already following him with wide, curious eyes. If Midnight could be seen as the protector he was, not the threat others imagined, maybe the foal's presence could help. But time was running thin, and proving a horse's worth to those unwilling to see it was like convincing a storm to change its path. Daniel opened the stall and stepped inside. Midnight lowered his head, breathing warm air against Daniel's chest. For a moment neither moved. It was as if the world outside, the sheriff's deadline, the whispers at the feed store, the watchful eyes of neighbors, had dissolved into the quiet rhythm of a shared heartbeat. "We've got to show them, boy," Daniel murmured, resting a hand against the stallion's neck. "We've got to make them believe." Later that morning, he led Midnight out into the training pen, the air sharp with the promise of rain. Every muscle in the stallion's body was coiled like a drawn bow, but Daniel kept his movements calm, steady. He didn't want to push too hard. Midnight's history with rough handling was a wound still healing, but he needed to see how the stallion would respond under pressure. At first, Midnight resisted, sidestepping the cues, ears flicking back. Then, gradually, something shifted. His strides became more fluid, his eyes less guarded. It was as if the space between them had narrowed, their trust deepening with each lap around the pen. By noon, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of oncoming rain. Daniel knew the weather could work in his favor. If the storm broke during the sheriff's visit, Midnight's composure under stress would be even more impressive. Still, there was no guarantee. The sheriff wasn't the only one to convince. Others had already made up their minds. "A horse that won't bend will break you," Old Man Harris had said at the diner, shaking his head. But Daniel had no intention of bending Midnight into something he wasn't. That evening, the storm finally rolled in, rain drumming against the tin roof, while lightning splintered the horizon. Daniel stood at the barn door, watching the sheets of water sweep across the pasture. Midnight stood in the shelter, unbothered by the noise, his dark coat shimmering under the flashes. Daniel took it as a quiet reassurance, proof that this was no ordinary horse. The next day brought more than just the sheriff. Half the town seemed to have found an excuse to drive by, their curiosity thinly veiled as concern. Daniel had expected as much. People wanted to witness the moment, whether it was triumph or failure. The sheriff leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low against the wind, and gave Daniel a curt nod. "Whenever you're ready." Daniel swallowed hard, then led Midnight into the open pen. The murmurs from the onlookers prickled against his skin, but he kept his focus on the stallion. The cues were simple: walk, trot, stop, but each movement carried the weight of judgment. At first, Midnight moved stiffly, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel spoke softly, letting his voice bridge the gap between command and comfort. Slowly, the stallion's movement smoothed, his head lowering in quiet submission. Then, just as Daniel thought they were turning the tide, a sudden crash echoed from the far end of the pasture, a tree limb snapping under the wind's force. The crowd gasped, and the foal whinnied in fright from its stall. Midnight froze, muscles taut. Daniel held his breath. This was the moment that could define them both. Instead of bolting, Midnight turned his head toward the sound, ears forward, then looked back at Daniel as if awaiting instruction. That single moment of stillness, that pause instead of panic, was worth more than any trick or display. Daniel gave the signal to move again, and Midnight obeyed without hesitation. When the session ended, the sheriff pushed off the fence, his gaze unreadable. "He's steady," he said at last, the words sounding almost reluctant. "I'll give you more time." Relief washed over Daniel, but it was tempered with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Trust could be built in days, but acceptance, especially in a place where doubt ran deep, would take much longer. Still, as the sheriff walked away and the onlookers dispersed, Daniel felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. Midnight stood beside him, ears flicking lazily in the breeze, as if he, too, knew they'd cleared the first hurdle. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. Daniel ran a hand down Midnight's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the damp coat. "We're not done yet," he whispered, and though the road ahead promised its share of storms, man and horse stood ready to face them, together.